The train screeched to a stop in the heart of Texas, dust swirling through the sunburnt air. Dozens of German POWs leaned from the windows, squinting at the endless horizon. "So this is where they hide their army?" one joked, earning scattered laughter. When the doors opened, heat slammed into them like a wall. Instead of soldiers in pressed uniforms, men in wide-brimmed hats and denim shirts waited by their horses. Their boots were dusty, their postures lazy, or so it seemed. The Germans exchanged grins. "Cowboys," one whispered mockingly. "They send cattle herders to guard us." Another spat into the dirt, amused by America's arrogance. But the cowboys said nothing. They stood quiet, sun at their backs, eyes hidden by the shade of their hats. One casually rested his hand on a holstered Colt, thumb tracing the worn leather like an old habit. As the prisoners were herded off the train, they laughed louder, their pride swelling with each step. To them, these men looked like relics from another century. Yet beneath the heat and calm drawls, something dangerous simmered. The camp itself wasn't what they expected. No walls, just barbed fences and open plains stretching forever. The cowboys led them past wooden barracks, their spurs jingling softly against the gravel. It was too quiet for comfort. When one German, a tall sergeant named Klaus, refused to move faster, a cowboy looked up from his cigarette. Without a word, he drew, fired a single shot, and shattered the heel of Klaus's boot. The laughter died instantly. Smoke curled from the cowboy's revolver, his eyes unreadable beneath his hat. "Next time," he said slowly, "I don't miss." Silence swept through the line as the POWs began to walk again, heads lowered. The cowboys exchanged small glances, not of cruelty, but of understanding. They didn't need discipline manuals or threats. Respect came on its own. That night, as the Germans sat behind wire fences, they could still hear the faint sound of horses snorting in the dark. These men who spoke little and smiled less were not fools. They were predators wrapped in calm. Klaus turned the shot-up heel in his hand, pale and trembling. "They are not farmers," he muttered. "They are something else." The others said nothing. When morning came, the cowboys moved like shadows, checking fences, feeding livestock, carrying rifles as easily as tools. There was no hatred in their eyes, only the quiet authority of men who feared nothing. The Germans stopped laughing after that day. The desert had introduced them to a new kind of soldier, one who fought without shouting, one who commanded without words. And as the sun rose again over the Texas plains, the prisoners finally understood. These weren't ranch hands. These were men who'd tamed the frontier. And now they were taming them. The next morning began before dawn, when the sky was still purple and cold. The cowboys woke the prisoners with a whistle instead of a shout. "Up, boys," one drawled. "The sun waits for no man." The Germans were given shovels, ropes, and gloves. Tools, not weapons. Their job was to mend fences and clear brush along the dry fields. It wasn't punishment, it was endurance training by another name. At first, they mocked the work. "Americans make us gardeners," one scoffed, tossing a clump of dirt aside. But when the sun climbed higher, the laughter began to fade beneath the heat. The cowboys worked beside them, quiet and tireless. Sweat ran down their backs, but not a single one slowed. They moved with the calm precision of men who had done this all their lives. Klaus watched one cowboy named Cooper lift a fence post single-handedly and drive it into the ground with a hammer swing that cracked like thunder. The man didn't even breathe heavily. Klaus lowered his gaze and kept digging. By midday, the desert shimmered with heat. The Germans' uniforms clung to their bodies like glue, while the cowboys moved easily, their hats shielding them from the glare. They made the impossible look effortless. When one prisoner collapsed, Cooper handed him a tin cup of water without a word. The German hesitated, ashamed, then drank greedily. "Don't thank me," Cooper said. "Thank the horse that carried it here." The humor was dry, but it struck something in them, a kind of respect that words couldn't undo. These weren't guards acting tough for show. They were men who lived by a code as harsh and honest as the land itself. That evening, the cowboys gathered by the corral, cleaning their revolvers in the fading light. The Germans watched from a distance, whispering about their skill. Every motion was casual, yet deadly precise. One cowboy spun his gun once and holstered it in a single blur of movement. The Germans fell silent, realizing that what looked like laziness was control, complete and absolute. After dinner, Cooper sat on a fence post, playing a slow tune on his harmonica. The sound drifted through the camp like a ghost of peace. Even Klaus listened, though he didn't understand why it hurt. As darkness fell, one German whispered, "They don't hate us." Another replied softly, "No, they just don't need to." The words lingered in the dry air like truth. When the lights went out, the cowboys took turns on watch, rifles resting loosely in their arms. They didn't patrol. They simply waited, confident no one would dare test them. And by the time the stars filled the Texas sky, every prisoner understood what real power looked like. Not loud, not cruel, but calm, quiet, and absolute. Days turned into weeks beneath the relentless Texas sun. The Germans grew leaner, quieter, their arrogance worn down by dust and labor. The cowboys, unchanged, seemed carved from the same earth they worked. One afternoon, a dust storm swept across the plains like a living wall. The prisoners panicked, shouting in confusion, while the cowboys moved with unhurried confidence, covering horses and shouting orders that cut through the wind. When the storm cleared, one prisoner was missing. Cooper rode out without hesitation, a coil of rope slung over his shoulder, vanishing into the orange haze. None of the Germans spoke. They simply watched, uneasy. He returned hours later with the lost man tied gently to his saddle, half conscious but alive. "He'd have walked to Mexico if the wind didn't kill him first," Cooper said. The Germans stared. Their mockery had no place here anymore. That evening, the rescued man tried to thank him in broken English. Cooper just shook his head and muttered, "Ain't about thanks, son. You're in my pasture. I look after what's mine." The words puzzled the Germans. To them, ownership meant control. But to these men, it meant responsibility, a lesson that landed deeper than any punishment could. Later that week, Klaus saw one cowboy practicing with a rope. The man twirled it lazily before flicking his wrist, the loop snapping tight around a fence post 10 feet away. It wasn't strength. It was mastery. When the cowboy noticed Klaus watching, he nodded once, tossed him the rope, and said, "Try." Klaus fumbled, missed completely, and handed it back, cheeks burning. The cowboy only smiled, not cruelly, but as a teacher might. By now, the prisoners had stopped laughing altogether. They began to imitate the cowboy's quiet discipline, rising early, working hard, speaking less. Somewhere in that silence, they found dignity again. One evening, a cowboy cleaned his Winchester rifle near the campfire. The Germans watched in fascination as he disassembled and reassembled it in seconds. When he looked up, his calm eyes met theirs. No threat, just certainty. A younger prisoner whispered, "They are not like our soldiers." Klaus replied softly, "No. They fight only when they must." It was the first time his voice held respect instead of pride. As night deepened, the cowboys sat under the stars, talking quietly about horses and weather. The Germans lay in their bunks, unable to sleep, haunted not by fear, but by admiration. For the first time since their capture, they no longer felt superior. They felt small beneath that endless Texas sky, humbled by men who conquered without conquest. And somewhere between the crack of the rope and the gleam of the rifle, the prisoners began to understand these cowboys didn't just survive the wild. They were the wild, and no army could tame them. Spring turned the desert a pale green, and the camp's routine became a kind of rhythm. The Germans no longer needed to be ordered. They worked beside the cowboys willingly. Pride had turned into quiet respect. Cooper began teaching them how to saddle horses. At first the Germans struggled, fumbling with leather straps and reins. But when they finally mounted, their laughter was genuine. The first laughter that didn't come from mockery. The cowboys watched, amused but approving. They saw men rediscovering something they'd buried under uniforms and orders: freedom. Even Klaus smiled the first time in months. One morning, a German accidentally broke a fence post. He froze, expecting punishment. Instead, Cooper handed him a hammer and said, "Then fix it." The simplicity stunned him. No threats, no shouting, just responsibility. By the end of the day, the fence stood stronger than before. As the sun set, the cowboys brewed coffee over the fire. The rich smell filled the camp, and they poured tin cups for the prisoners. No words were spoken, only the soft clinking of metal and the shared warmth of silence. That night, the Germans lay beneath the stars, unable to sleep. One whispered, "These men, they do not fight for orders. They fight for what is right in front of them." The others nodded in the dark. The next day brought a small rebellion. A young German refused to work. The cowboys didn't shout or aim rifles. Cooper just handed him a shovel and said, "Suit yourself." But the ground won't dig itself. Hours later, when the sun burned high, the boy picked up the shovel. He didn't do it for survival. He did it out of shame. Even he had grown tired of defiance. At midday, the cowboys let them rest near the horses. One German reached out hesitantly to touch a mare's muzzle. The animal didn't flinch, a small miracle of trust that none of them missed. Iko, the mare's handler, smiled faintly. "She knows you mean no harm," he said softly. The words struck deeper than intended, a truth about all of them. That evening, John, the oldest cowboy, told a story around the fire about the Civil War and brothers fighting brothers. The Germans listened, realizing that Americans, too, carried ghosts. Klaus asked, "And after the war?" John sipped his coffee and said, "You mend fences, the ones on the land and the ones in your heart." No one spoke after that. The fire cracked, and for the first time, the Germans and cowboys sat together as equals, men scarred by different wars, sharing the same dust. And maybe the same hope. Summer returned with blazing skies and rattlesnakes hiding in the brush. The days stretched endlessly, and tempers began to fray under the weight of heat and monotony. The cowboys, however, stayed calm. Patience was their weapon. One afternoon, a supply truck failed to arrive. The Germans noticed the cowboys' concern. They had little water left, and the nearest town was a half-day's ride. Cooper saddled his horse and pointed toward Klaus. "You ride with me." The prisoners gasped, whispering in disbelief. A guard alone with a POW on open land was unthinkable. But Cooper only shrugged and said, "If he runs, he won't make it a mile." The ride was silent at first. The sun beat down like iron, and the land stretched endlessly ahead. Klaus stole glances at the cowboy, his face unreadable, his grip on the reins loose but sure. Halfway through, they stopped by a dried creek bed. Cooper dismounted, knelt, and dug with his hands until muddy water surfaced. "You'd be surprised what's still alive under the dust," he said. Klaus drank greedily, the muddy water tasting better than wine. He stared at the man beside him, suddenly unsure who was the prisoner and who was free. When they reached town, the sheriff raised an eyebrow. "You trust him?" Cooper smirked. "He's had plenty of chances to kill me. Guess he's not stupid." They loaded supplies in silence. A few townsfolk stared at Klaus, muttering about the German. Cooper ignored them, tossing a canteen toward him. "Don't mind, folks. They ain't seen the world past the river." On the ride back, a sudden rattlesnake struck near Klaus's boot. Cooper's gun flashed once. The snake lay still. "Fast," Klaus said quietly. "Faster than fear," Cooper replied. Back at camp, the prisoners crowded around, expecting shouts or punishment. Instead, Cooper dropped the supplies and said, "He did fine." Then he tossed Klaus an apple, the first fruit he'd tasted in months. That night, Klaus sat apart from the others, turning the apple in his hands. It wasn't the gift that unsettled him. It was the trust that came with it. He realized that in all his years of training and war, no one had ever trusted him without suspicion. Yet here, in enemy hands, a cowboy had done just that. As the camp quieted under the stars, Klaus bit into the apple. Its sweetness felt like a promise, one he knew he'd never forget. And from that night onward, the word cowboy no longer meant ridicule among the prisoners. It meant strength, decency, and the kind of honor no uniform could ever command. A violent windstorm rolled in one night, tearing through the camp like a beast unchained. The cowboys shouted over the roar, struggling to keep the horses calm as the fence posts snapped one by one. Dust and fear filled the air. By morning, half the perimeter lay in ruins. The Germans stood staring at the broken wire, realizing freedom was a few steps away. No guard stopped them, only the horizon and the choice of what kind of men they wanted to be. Cooper and John surveyed the damage, exhaustion etched into their faces. They didn't raise their rifles or bark orders. They simply began gathering posts and wire. Their trust was a test more powerful than any lock. Klaus met Cooper's eyes across the field. No words passed between them, but the message was clear. Help us rebuild. One by one, the Germans joined in, working side by side with the men they once mocked. All day they labored, driving stakes into the dry earth until their hands bled. Sweat mixed with dust, and the fence slowly rose again, not as a barrier, but as a bond. The cowboys didn't thank them, but their silence spoke volumes. When the last post was set, Cooper tossed a canteen toward Klaus. "You could have run," he said. Klaus nodded, wiping dirt from his face. "And go where?" "My freedom is here." That night, they shared a single campfire. No sides, no ranks, just men breathing the same weary air. One German hummed an old song. A cowboy joined in on harmonica. And somehow the melodies fit together. In that moment, the war seemed far away, a ghost belonging to another world. The prisoners had earned trust the same way the cowboys earned respect, through sweat, not talk. When dawn came, the camp looked the same as before, but something invisible had changed. The wire gleamed in the sunlight, no longer a cage, but a symbol of the strange brotherhood forged in dust. A letter arrived weeks later from the Army Command, praising the cowboys for maintaining discipline with minimal force. Cooper laughed softly. "Force ain't what keeps men in line," he said. "It's the fence inside 'em." The Germans understood now. They had been trained to obey fear, but the cowboys ruled by something stronger. Respect freely given and silently earned. As the wind swept across the plains, Klaus looked at the rebuilt fence one last time. "It's stronger now," he said. Cooper replied, "So are you." That night, the sky burned orange as the sun fell behind the hills. The men stood quietly, side by side, their shadows long and even. And though the wire separated them once more, It no longer felt like a divide, just a reminder of what they'd built together when the fence fell. As summer deepened, training resumed, not for battle, but for survival. The cowboys began teaching the prisoners to ride properly, to shoot safely, to understand the balance between power and restraint. The lessons came without anger, only patience. Cooper demonstrated first, drawing and firing at a tin can 20 paces away. The crack echoed through the air, the can spinning off the fence post. "It ain't the gun," he said. "It's the steadiness of the hand." The Germans tried next, awkward with the revolver's weight. Their shots missed by yards, the recoil surprising them. The cowboys smiled but said nothing. Silence was its own teacher. Klaus, determined, steadied his breathing and aimed again. This time, his shot clipped the can's edge. Cooper nodded once. "Good. Don't rush truth, or bullets." The days that followed were filled with practice. The Germans learned that marksmanship was not about pride, but discipline. A steady hand revealed more about a man than his rank ever could. When one prisoner grew frustrated and threw his revolver aside, Cooper simply picked it up, handed it back, and said, "Quit fighting the tool. Fight yourself." The words hit harder than any bullet. The cowboys also trained them to handle ropes, to guide horses through the open field. The same men who once marched with rifles now herded cattle under the Texas sun. Their movements slow, deliberate, humble. Klaus grew fond of one chestnut horse named Ruby. When she startled at thunder, he calmed her gently, whispering in German. Cooper watched and said quietly, "You got it now." Patience breaks what force never can. The camp began to feel less like a prison and more like a ranch. The air carried laughter again, the kind that came from pride, not arrogance. Even the guards found themselves working shoulder to shoulder with the men they once distrusted. One evening, a German approached Cooper hesitantly and asked to clean his revolver. Cooper raised an eyebrow, then handed it over without a word. When the man returned it spotless, the cowboy simply said, "Told you. Trust a heavier weapon than this." As the sun sank, the men gathered to watch the sky turn gold and red. The guns lay on a table nearby, empty and gleaming. Tools of balance, not violence. No one needed to touch them anymore. Klaus stared at his reflection in one of the polished barrels. "We came here soldiers," he said softly, "but they made us men." Cooper heard him but didn't reply. He just smiled under his hat. The night was quiet, save for the creak of saddles and the hum of cicadas. The line between captor and captive had blurred completely. All that remained was grit, dust, and respect. And under the endless stars of the Texas plains, the Germans finally understood. The cowboys' real weapon wasn't the gun. It was the life they lived without fear. It happened just before dawn, when the air was cool and the sky faintly gray. 3 prisoners, newly transferred from another camp, decided to run. They thought these cowboys were too soft, too trusting. They cut through the fence quietly, boots crunching against dry soil. The others watched in silence, torn between fear and disbelief. Klaus turned away, knowing how this would end. By the time the sun rose, the escapees were miles away, running blind across open land. They didn't realize the desert had no mercy, and that cowboys didn't chase. They tracked. Cooper and 2 others saddled their horses with calm precision. "No hurry," he said softly. "The land will slow 'em down for us." His tone was steady, as if retrieving lost cattle, not fugitives. Hours passed before they found the first set of footprints turning south. Cooper dismounted, knelt, and touched the sand. "Too deep," he muttered. "They're tired already." The others nodded silently. When they finally spotted the men in the distance, the cowboys didn't draw guns or shout. They just rode closer, the horses' pace easy but relentless. The Germans stopped running long before the horses stopped moving. One prisoner reached for his pocket knife, a useless, desperate gesture. In a blink, Cooper's revolver was drawn, steady, eyes cold but not cruel. "Don't make me prove it again," he said. The men dropped to their knees, breathing hard. Cooper holstered his gun slowly, then handed one of them a canteen. "Drink. You'll walk back on your own feet." When they returned to camp, no one cheered or mocked them. The cowboys tied their horses, ate lunch, and went back to work, as if nothing had happened. The message was clear. Order didn't need noise. That evening, Klaus approached the escapees sitting alone by the fire. "Did they hit you?" he asked quietly. One shook his head. "No. They just looked at us, and we stopped running." The story spread through the camp like a wind through tall grass. Even those who still carried defiance in their hearts felt it flicker and fade. You couldn't hate men who had nothing to prove. Later that night, Cooper rode along the fence line, the moonlight silvering his hat. He stopped by the rebuilt section and smiled faintly. "Still holding," he whispered, patting the wire like an old friend. Klaus watched from the shadows, realizing the truth that had taken him months to learn. The cowboys didn't guard with guns, they guarded with reputation, the kind no man dared test twice. And as the crickets sang through the night, the camp slept soundly behind its quiet defenders, the legend of the cowboys' calm, spreading even faster than their bullets ever could. Autumn came to the desert like a whisper, the air cooler, the sun gentler. The Germans had stopped counting days. The camp now felt more like a ranch than a prison. Even the horses seemed to sense the peace that had settled there. One morning, the army truck brought a sack of mail from across the ocean. Most letters were for the cowboys, but a few were marked for the prisoners. Cooper dropped them off with the same care he gave his own. Klaus received one addressed in shaky handwriting. It was from his mother, who had believed him dead. Tears cut clean lines down his dust-covered face as he read her words of disbelief and relief. Other prisoners gathered around, sharing bits of their letters aloud. There was laughter, there were tears, and the cowboys, though pretending not to listen, couldn't hide their small smiles. That evening, Cooper handed Klaus a pencil and paper. "Write her back," he said simply. "Let her know Texas don't bite." Klaus chuckled softly for the first time in months. He wrote slowly, struggling with the English he had learned. "I am safe," he wrote. "The men here wear hats and smile, but they shoot straighter than anyone." His hand trembled as he added, "They treat us like men." The letter became a camp event, every man adding a line to send home. "We eat well. We work the land. They let us laugh again." The cowboys pretended not to notice, but pride glimmered behind their stoic faces. A few days later, the Red Cross came to collect the letters. The officer in charge asked Cooper if discipline was ever a problem. Cooper smirked, tilting his hat. "Not when a man's got a shovel and a conscience." When the officer left, the camp returned to its slow, steady rhythm. Letters became a bridge across oceans, carrying stories not of hatred, but of humanity. The Germans began calling the cowboys the quiet guards. One night, as the wind moved gently through the grass, Klaus said, "They'll never believe us back home." Another answered, "That's all right. We'll remember for them." The cowboys nearby said nothing, but nodded. The next day, the men worked side by side, no fences between them. Trust had replaced boundaries, and respect had replaced fear. It was the rarest victory the war had ever seen. When Cooper passed by, he tipped his hat toward Klaus. "Mail's gone," he said. "Guess Texas is heading to Germany now." Klaus laughed quietly. "And maybe Germany will come back a little Texas." That night, the sky stretched endlessly above them, clear and endless. Somewhere out there, words written in 2 languages were crossing oceans, carrying stories of cowboys, guns, and unexpected grace. And as the firelight flickered across their faces, both prisoner and cowboy knew those letters would outlive them all, telling the world that even in war, men could still choose to be kind. Winter drifted softly across Texas, painting the plains in pale gold and frost. The war had ended months ago, but the news reached this place slowly, carried by tired trucks and letters stamped with peace. The prisoners would be going home soon. The announcement brought silence to the camp. Some men smiled, others looked lost. Freedom, after so long, suddenly felt like a strange kind of uncertainty. Klaus stood by the corral, watching Ruby, the chestnut horse, pawing at the cold dirt. Cooper approached, hands in his pockets. "She's gonna miss you," he said, voice low and even. Klaus smiled faintly. "I think I will miss her more." Cooper nodded,